Kael's first sensation was wrong. He tried to blink, but his eyelids didn't obey. He tried to breathe, but his chest didn't rise. Panic clawed at him as he realized he had no chest, no limbs, no face, only a vague, gelatinous awareness. The air smelled of damp stone and something metallic, like old blood. He was a translucent green blob, quivering on the cold floor of a cave. Memories flooded back in fragments. The alchemist's workshop, cluttered with bubbling vials and arcane diagrams. The rogue alchemist, what was his name? Varen? No, something else, had promised a simple enhancement potion. Kael had paid his last silver for a chance to boost his strength before his next dungeon delve. But the potion had hissed and smoked, and the alchemist's eyes had gleamed with cruel satisfaction. Then an explosion of green light and darkness. Now this. A slime. He tried to scream, but no sound came. He could only vibrate, his entire being a single, pulsing knot of fear. The cave was small, barely the size of a storage room. Faint bioluminescent moss clung to the walls, casting a sickly blue glow. Stalactites dripped water into shallow puddles, each plink echoing like a distant bell. The floor was rough, uneven stone, littered with bones, small animal bones, mostly, but a few that looked disturbingly human. Kael tried to move, and his body responded by oozing forward a few inches. The sensation was bizarre, like crawling with his entire skin. A sound broke the stillness, a skittering, scraping noise from a crevice in a far wall. Kael's perception sharpened. He could feel vibrations through the stone, sensed the heat of something approaching. A rat emerged, but not an ordinary rat. It was the size of a large dog, with matted black fur, red eyes, and teeth that glistened with saliva. Its claws clicked on the stone as it sniffed the air, its gaze locking onto Kael. Instinct screamed at him. He had no weapons, no spells, no body to fight with. But the slime's form rippled, and he felt a strange hunger, not in his stomach, because he didn't have one, but in his very essence. The hunger was primal, demanding. Consume. Evolve. The rat lunged. Kael tried to dodge, but his movements were sluggish, clumsy. The rat's claws raked through his gelatinous body, and pain exploded through him, a burning, searing agony that felt like being torn apart. But the wound didn't bleed, it simply closed, leaving a faint scar in his translucent form. The rat's attack had passed through him, but it had also left a piece of itself behind, a few hairs, a fleck of skin. Kael's hunger surged. He didn't think, he acted. He lunged forward, his entire body stretching like a net, enveloping the rat's head. The rat squealed and thrashed, its claws tearing at him, but Kael held on. His digestive acids, how did he have digestive acids, began to work, dissolving the rat's flesh. The process was agonizing. He felt every cell of the rat breaking down, being absorbed into his own being. The rat's memories flickered through his mind, a brief life of scavenging, the terror of larger predators, the taste of rotten meat. Then nothing. When it was over, the rat was gone. Kael was larger now, his green form darker, more viscous. He felt stronger, more solid. A notification appeared in his mind, not in words but in pure understanding, basic digestion acquired. Evolution to slime, stage 2, complete. But something was missing. He tried to remember his full name. Kael. Kael what? The surname was gone, erased like a chalkboard wiped clean. He could remember his mother's face, his sister's laughter, the cobblestone streets of his hometown. But the name that tied him to his family, vanished. A cold dread settled in his core. Each evolution would take something from him. And he had only just begun. A distant roar echoed through the cave, deep and guttural, shaking the walls. Kael's new senses picked up vibrations from beyond the crevice, a larger chamber, filled with the sounds of many creatures. And light. A flickering, golden light, like a portal. His only way out. But between him and that light, the roar suggested something monstrous. He had no choice. He had to move forward. He had to evolve. And each time, he would lose a piece of himself. But if he didn't, he would die here, forgotten, a slime in the dark. Kael oozed toward the crevice, his form trembling with fear and determination. The hunt was about to begin. The cave air clung to Kael like a wet shroud, heavy with the stench of damp stone and decay. His gelatinous body quivered as he pressed himself against the rough wall, translucent green rippling with each labored pulse of what passed for his heart. The distant roar still echoed in his memory, a promise of death lurking beyond this tunnel. He had to move. He had to survive. Ahead, a cluster of smaller slimes bobbed in the darkness, pale, fist-sized blobs that glowed with a sickly luminescence. They drifted aimlessly across the cavern floor, leaving trails of acidic slime that sizzled against the rock. Kael hesitated, his mind racing. He remembered the giant rat, the way his body had instinctively dissolved it, the surge of power that had come with the cost of his surname. He couldn't afford to lose more. But he was weak, barely more than a puddle of jelly. If he encountered another predator, he'd be devoured. Steeling himself, he slithered forward. The smaller slimes didn't notice him until he was upon them, his form spreading over the first like a net. The creature struggled, a faint vibration of panic rippling through its mass, but Kael's digestive acids burned through it in seconds. A warmth spread through him, not unlike the satisfaction of a full meal, and his body grew denser, more stable. He repeated the process twice more, each consumption smoothing the jagged edges of his form. By the time the last slime dissolved, he felt solid. Not strong, but no longer on the verge of collapse. The cave widened into a chamber, and there, slumped against a pillar of stalactite, was a skeleton. Human. The bones were yellowed with age, the ribcage shattered as if by a massive blow. A leather-bound journal lay open beside a skeletal hand, its pages curled and stained. Kael approached cautiously, his slime body oozing over the uneven floor. He had no hands to turn the pages, so he pressed his mass against the book, absorbing the words through his membrane. The first entry was frantic, scrawled in a shaking hand, Day 7. The slime mutation is irreversible. I've consumed 3 goblins, a wolf, and a cave lizard. Each evolution takes something. I forgot my mother's name today. I can see her face, but the word is gone. I'm writing this down so I don't forget what I'm losing. If you find this, know that every evolution erases a memory. Permanently. There is no recovery. Choose carefully what you become, or you will become nothing. Kael's core chilled. He had already lost his surname. What next? His sister's face. His own name. The journal went on, detailing the author's desperate attempts to find a way out, only to be cornered by a pack of wolves in this very chamber. The final entry was a single word, forgive. A howl echoed from the tunnel behind him. Kael spun, his form tensing. Shadows moved at the entrance, 5 pairs of glowing eyes. Wolves. Their bodies were lean, fur matted with blood and grime, jaws dripping saliva. The alpha, a massive brute with a scarred snout, stepped forward, sniffing the air. Its gaze locked onto Kael's faint glow. Panic surged through Kael's thoughts. He couldn't fight them. Even with his new stability, he was no match for a pack. He needed to hide. His mind raced through his abilities, basic digestion, basic mimicry, goblin's cunning, hobgoblin's strength. Mimicry. The skill description flickered in his awareness, copy the texture of an observed object for a short duration. Cost, 1 day of lifespan. 1 day. He had no idea how long he could live as a slime, but a day seemed trivial compared to the alternative. He focused on the rock beside him, its rough, gray surface pitted with age. His body rippled, the translucent green darkening to a muddy gray, his surface roughening into stone-like ridges. He pressed himself flat against the wall, becoming a patch of rock indistinguishable from the rest. The wolves padded into the chamber, their claws clicking against stone. The alpha sniffed the air again, its head swinging toward Kael's position. He held his breath, did slimes even breathe, and willed himself to be still. The wolf stepped closer, its snout inches from his surface. A hot gust of breath washed over him, carrying the stench of carrion. Then, the wolf turned away, following the scent of the skeleton. Relief flooded through Kael, but it was short-lived. The alpha stopped at the journal, pawing at it. It let out a low growl, and the pack spread out, sniffing the chamber's perimeter. One of the younger wolves trotted directly toward Kael's hiding spot. Its nose twitched, and it paused, head cocked. A whine escaped its throat. The alpha's ears perked up, and it turned, eyes narrowing. Kael's mimicry held, but the wolf was persistent. It pawed at his surface, claws scraping against the rock-like texture. Pain lanced through him, a sharp, alien sensation that made his core throb. He didn't move. The wolf barked, a sharp, echoing sound that bounced off the walls. The alpha padded over, its massive form blocking the light from the tunnel. It sniffed Kael's surface, then let out a growl that vibrated through the stone. It knew. Somehow, it knew. The alpha's lips peeled back, revealing yellowed fangs. Its muscles coiled, and without warning, it lunged, jaws wide, aiming directly for Kael's core. Time slowed. Kael's thoughts crystallized into a single, desperate realization: he had no escape. The mimicry had failed. The pack surrounded him. The alpha's maw descended, a cavern of teeth and death. He had one chance, to drop the mimicry, to use Goblin's cunning to outwit them, but his mind was blank with terror. The jaws closed in, and the world narrowed to the glint of saliva on those fangs. Then, the alpha's body slammed into him, and everything went dark. The alpha wolf's jaws snapped shut inches from Kael's gelatinous body, its hot breath reeking of carrion. He had no time to think, only to react. With a desperate pulse of his core, he willed his form to flatten, spreading himself paper-thin against the rocky floor. The wolf's claws scraped over him, gouging grooves in the stone where his bulk had been moments before. Pain lanced through his being, not physical, but a deep, resonant ache that reminded him he was still alive, still something. He didn't wait for the second attack. Rolling like a liquid coin, he slipped between the wolf's legs and into a crevice too narrow for the beast to follow. The alpha snarled, its yellow eyes boring into the darkness, but it could not squeeze through. Kael pressed himself deeper, feeling the rough walls of the tunnel scrape against his membrane. The passage sloped downward, growing damp and cool, the air thick with the stench of earth and something else, something acrid and organic. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had little meaning in this form, where hunger and fear were the only clocks. The tunnel widened into a cavern, and Kael's slime body absorbed the faint bioluminescence of glowing fungi clinging to the ceiling. The light was weak, but enough to see that he was not alone. The cavern floor was littered with bones, small, humanoid bones, cracked and gnawed. Scattered among them were crude tools, chipped stone knives, wooden spears with sharpened tips, and the remnants of a fire pit. This was a lair, and the inhabitants were close. Kael's core pulsed with alarm, but he had nowhere else to go. The wolves were behind him, ahead lay unknown dangers. He slithered forward, keeping to the shadows, his body adapting to the uneven terrain. A glint caught his attention, a shard of something crystalline, embedded in the wall. It pulsed with a faint, internal light, and Kael felt an inexplicable pull toward it. This was no ordinary stone. It was a goblin shard, a remnant of a creature's essence, left behind when a goblin died in this very spot. The journal had mentioned such things, concentrated cores of monster life, usable for evolution. He approached cautiously, but the shard offered no resistance. As he touched it, his body instinctively began to absorb it. The shard dissolved into a warm, tingling energy that spread through his core, and with it came a flood of sensations, a new understanding of movement, of aggression, of cunning. His form rippled and shifted, growing denser, taking on a more defined shape. Limbs emerged, stubby and green-skinned. A head formed, with large ears and a mouth full of sharp, yellow teeth. He stood on two legs, looking down at his new hands, which clutched a crude stone knife that had materialized from the absorbed essence. He was a goblin now. The thought brought a surge of pride, quickly followed by a pang of loss. He tried to remember his sister's favorite color, the hue she had loved as a child, the one she painted her room with. It was gone. The memory was a blank spot, a hole in his mind where something precious used to be. He clenched his new fists, the stone knife digging into his palm. The cost was real, and it hurt more than any wound. But he couldn't dwell on it. Survival demanded focus. He tested his new abilities, Goblin's cunning, whispered strategies in his mind, showing him how to use the environment, how to set traps, how to read the intentions of others. It was a cold, calculating voice, but it was useful. He moved deeper into the cavern, his footsteps light, his senses sharp. A sound broke the silence, a guttural muttering, followed by a cough. Kael pressed himself against the wall, peering around a corner. A goblin scout stood guard near a tunnel entrance, its back to him. It was smaller than his new form, armed with a rusty dagger, and seemed bored, kicking at a pebble with its bare foot. Kael's mind raced. He could attack, but the scout might raise an alarm. He needed information, and the scout was his only source. He crept closer, using the shadows and the cluttered bones to mask his approach. The scout turned just as Kael lunged, but he was faster. He wrapped one arm around the scout's throat, pressing the stone knife against its neck. "Don't move," Kael hissed, the words coming out in a raspy, guttural tongue that surprised him. He understood it instantly, goblin. The scout froze, its eyes wide with terror. "Please, don't kill me," it whimpered. What do you want? Information, Kael said. How many of you are here? Where is the exit? The scout stammered answers, its voice trembling. Kael learned of the warren's layout, the main chamber where the chief held court, the nursery where the young were kept, the armory with better weapons. He learned that the exit was blocked by a collapsed tunnel, but there was another way, through the chief's quarters. The chief was a hobgoblin, massive and brutal, who had killed the previous leader and taken control. Kael's grip tightened. Is there another way out of the dungeon? The scout shook its head. Only through the chief. He has a key to the locked gate that leads to the surface. A key. Hope flickered in Kael's chest. He could escape, if he could defeat the hobgoblin. But he needed more power, more memories to sacrifice. He released the scout, shoving it hard against the wall. Forget you saw me, or I'll come back. The scout nodded frantically and scrambled away, disappearing into the darkness. Kael turned, his mind already forming a plan. He would find the armory, equip himself better, and then confront the chief. But as he moved, a heavy footstep echoed through the cavern, followed by a roar that shook the walls. He looked up. The hobgoblin chief stood at the entrance to the main chamber, its eyes locked onto him. It was twice his size, with muscles like knotted ropes and a jagged axe in its hand. It bellowed a war cry, and from behind it, a dozen goblins emerged, their weapons drawn. Kael's new goblin heart pounded. He had no time to prepare, no allies, no plan. But he had goblin's cunning, and he had the will to survive. He gripped his stone knife tighter, ready to fight for his life. The hobgoblin chief's roar echoed through the warren, a guttural sound that vibrated in Kael's chest. He pressed his back against the damp earth wall, the stone knife slick in his three-fingered hand. The goblin form felt wrong, too short, too weak, the joints aching with an unfamiliar bend. But the fear was real. It clawed at his throat, made his heart hammer against his ribs as a dozen goblins poured into the tunnel, their eyes glinting with malice. He couldn't fight them all. The stone knife was barely a toothpick against the hobgoblin's massive frame. The chief stood 7 feet tall, muscles corded like iron, a crude axe in its grip. Kael's mind raced, but every thought dissolved into static. He was going to die here, forgotten, a slime that never was. Then something stirred inside him. A warmth, like an ember catching flame. It pulsed from the core of his being, the place where memories clung like cobwebs. He felt it, a thread of pure terror, raw and suffocating. But instead of drowning him, it began to unravel. The fear didn't vanish, it transformed. It became fuel, a liquid fire that coursed through his veins and ignited goblin's cunning into something sharper, faster. Soul anchoring. The name surfaced from the depths of his fading humanity. A technique born of desperation, allowing him to sacrifice his negative emotions for power. The fear burned away, leaving a cold clarity. He could see the trap now, a loose stone in the ceiling, a weak point in the warren's construction. The hobgoblin chief was too large to dodge quickly. If he could lure it under that spot. The goblins advanced, their crude spears and clubs raised. Kael didn't retreat. He stepped forward, a grin spreading across his goblin face. You want to fight? He hissed, his voice a rasp. Come and get me. He turned and ran, not away, but deeper into the warren. The hobgoblin chief bellowed and gave chase, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground. Kael weaved through tunnels, his smaller body slipping through gaps the goblins couldn't follow. He led them on a wild chase, always keeping the chief in sight, always moving toward the chamber with the unstable ceiling. He reached it, a wide cavern where the ceiling sagged, cracked spiderwebbing across the stone. A single pillar of rock supported the whole thing. Kael skidded to a halt and turned to face the hobgoblin. The chief burst through the tunnel, its goblin retinue close behind. It raised its axe, a triumphant roar on its lips. Kael threw the stone knife. It wasn't meant to kill. It clattered against the pillar, chipping the already weakened stone. A rumble answered. Dust rained down. The hobgoblin's eyes widened as it realized the trap. But it was too late. The pillar cracked, and the ceiling gave way. Thunder filled the cavern. Boulders crashed down, crushing the goblins beneath them. The hobgoblin chief tried to flee, but a slab of rock caught its leg, pinning it. It screamed, a terrible sound that cut off as another boulder silenced it forever. Kael stood at the edge of the collapse, panting. The dust settled, revealing a pile of rubble and broken bodies. He had won. But the victory felt hollow. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange emptiness. He climbed over the rocks to the hobgoblin's corpse. Its flesh was still warm. He didn't hesitate. He began to consume. The evolution came faster this time. His body twisted, grew. The goblin form stretched into something larger, more powerful. Muscles bulged. His skin thickened into a tough hide. The stone knife had been lost in the collapse, but his hands were now weapons in themselves. He felt the change settle, a new strength coursing through him. Hobgoblin form. But as the evolution completed, a memory slipped away. A scent, warm and familiar, his mother's cooking. The smell of bread baking, of herbs simmering in a pot. It dissolved like smoke, leaving only a void where it had been. He tried to grasp it, but it was gone. He couldn't remember what his mother's food tasted like. He couldn't remember her face. Tears welled in his eyes, though he didn't understand why. He wiped them away with a rough hand. The hobgoblin's axe lay half buried in the rubble. He picked it up, feeling its weight. It was a crude weapon, but it would serve. Then he saw her. A woman's face, floating in his mind's eye. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, and she was laughing at something he had said. The image was vivid, achingly beautiful. He reached for it, desperate to hold on to it. But it flickered, like a candle in the wind. He tried to remember her name, but it was gone. The face began to fade, the edges blurring. He screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the warren. But the vision dissolved into darkness, leaving him alone with the knowledge that he had forgotten something precious. He didn't know who she was. But his heart ached for her. He clutched the axe and stood in a silent cavern, the dust settling around him. The path forward was clear. Beyond the rubble, a tunnel led deeper into the dungeon, toward the exit and the demigod that guarded it. But for a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, trying to hold on to the ghost of a memory that had already slipped away. The stream's murmur guided Kael through a winding tunnel, its walls slick with phosphorescent moss that cast a sickly green glow. His hobgoblin body, thick with muscle and covered in coarse gray skin, moved with a newfound steadiness. The memory of his mother's cooking, a warm stew with herbs he could almost taste, was gone, replaced by a hollow ache he couldn't name. He gripped the crude axe, its wooden handle rough against his calloused palm, and pressed forward. The stream widened into a shallow pool, its surface rippling with a faint silver light. Beyond it, a grove of luminescent fungi rose like twisted pillars, their caps shedding a soft blue radiance. In the center stood a stone altar, carved with symbols that pulsed with a malevolent red glow. Chained to it was a figure, a woman, her skin pale as moonlight, her hair a cascade of silver that pooled on the stone floor. She wore tattered robes, once white, now stained with dirt and dried blood. An iron collar circled her neck, linked to the altar by a thick chain. Kael's heart, or what passed for it in this monstrous body, lurched. He approached cautiously, the axe held ready. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. They were a vivid emerald, sharp and intelligent, but clouded with exhaustion. Her lips cracked as she tried to speak, her voice a whisper. "You are not one of them." He stopped a few paces away. "Who are you?" His own voice grated from his throat, a guttural sound that still surprised him. "Lyra," she said, her gaze dropping to his axe. "I am Lyra, daughter of the Elven King. They brought me here as an offering to the demigod." She tugged at the chains, her wrists raw and bleeding. "I have been here for 3 days. No food. No water. The demigod feeds on the life force of its sacrifices." Kael studied the altar, the symbols glowing brighter as if sensing his presence. A low hum vibrated through the stones. "How do I break the chains?" Lyra's eyes widened. "You would help me? You know a way out of this dungeon?" She nodded weakly. "I was captured while exploring the upper passages. I know a route that bypasses the demigod's lair. But the chains are enchanted. Only brute force can break them, and even then, it will cost you." Kael didn't hesitate. He activated hobgoblin strength, feeling the surge of power flood his limbs. His muscles swelled, veins bulging against his skin. He swung the axe in a great arc, the blade striking the chain with a shower of sparks. The impact sent a shockwave through his arm, but the chain held. He struck again, and again, each blow sending tremors through the altar. On the fourth strike, the chain snapped with a deafening crack. Lyra collapsed forward, gasping. Kael caught her, his massive hands gentle despite their strength. He could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her robes. She was barely alive. "Thank you," she whispered. "But we must hurry. The demigod will have felt the breaking of its seal." As if on cue, the ground shook. A deep, resonant voice boomed through the grove, shaking the fungi and sending ripples across the pool. "Who dares touch my offering?" Lyra's face drained of color. "He knows. We have minutes, at most." Kael helped her to her feet, supporting her weight. "Which way?" She pointed to a narrow crevice behind the altar, hidden by a curtain of moss. "Through there. It leads to a series of tunnels that open near the surface. But we must move fast." Kael glanced back at the grove. The red glow of the altar had intensified, and the symbols were now blazing, casting long shadows. The voice returned, closer this time. "You cannot hide from me, little slime. I will find you, and I will devour your soul." Without another word, Kael dragged Lyra toward the crevice, shoving her through first. He followed, his broad shoulders scraping against the stone walls. The darkness swallowed them, and behind them, the grove erupted in a roar of fury. The crevice widened into a cavern of jagged obsidian, its walls slick with moisture that gleamed like black tears. Kael's slime body trembled, still adjusting to the strain of hobgoblin's strength. Beside him, Lyra leaned against a stalagmite, her elven features gaunt from starvation, but her eyes burned with defiant fire. She clutched a shard of rock like a dagger, her torn robes barely covering her frame. "We need to move," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "He knows where we are." Before Kael could respond, the air thickened. A pressure descended, crushing, suffocating. The cavern's shadows pooled together, coalescing into a colossal serpentine form. Scales of molten gold and abyssal black spiraled around a torso that was half man, half beast. Two eyes, each the size of a shield, fixed upon them, one blazing like a sun, the other cold as a dead star. The demigod's voice resonated not from its maw, but from the very stone, the water, the air itself. "Little slime. Little princess. You run, but the abyss has no end." Kael's core pulsed with primal fear. He had faced monsters, goblins, hobgoblins, a wormling, but this was something else. This was a fragment of divinity, a being that had feasted on prayers and sacrifices for centuries. His goblin's cunning screamed at him to negotiate, to find an angle. But his heart, whatever remained of it, knew the truth: there was no bargaining with a god. The serpentine head lowered, its breath hot and rancid, smelling of decayed hopes. "I offer you a choice, slime. Leave the princess. Return to the altar. I will grant you the dragonkin form, no evolution cost, no memory lost. You will be strong enough to challenge the upper floors. You will see sunlight again." Lyra's hand tightened on her rock shard. Her eyes met Kael's gelatinous surface, searching for his decision. He could feel her desperation, her hope, her fear that he would take the deal. She was nothing to him but a means to an end, a guide, a key. But her life hung in the balance, and the demigod's offer was real. Dragonkin form. No cost. No memory of his sister erased. His sister. He couldn't remember her name. He couldn't remember her face. But he remembered the feeling of her hand in his, small and warm. He remembered promising to protect her. If he took this deal, he would keep that promise. But he would be abandoning Lyra to a fate worse than death, eternal sacrifice to a being that would drain her soul drop by drop. "No," Kael said, his voice a vibration through his slime body. "I don't make deals with monsters." The demigod's eyes narrowed. The temperature plummeted. Frost spiderwebbed across the obsidian walls. "Fool. You cling to a ghost of a memory. That princess will betray you the moment it suits her. Elves are liars, thieves of trust. I have seen empires crumble on their promises." Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling limbs. "You know nothing of my people, serpent. We have guarded the forest since before your kind crawled from the mud." Kael focused inward. He reached for the soul-anchoring technique, the painful process of sacrificing negative emotions instead of memories. He had used it once before, to evolve from goblin to hobgoblin. Now he needed something else, a skill to break this vision, to buy them time. He found it, Hobgoblin's roar, a sonic blast that could stun lesser beings. But activating it required a sacrifice. He chose his regret, the bitter, gnawing regret of trusting the rogue alchemist, of following a stranger into a dark alley. That regret had cost him his humanity. Let it cost him this instead. A wave of nausea washed over him as the emotion was ripped from his core. It felt like losing a piece of his past, but not a memory, just the pain attached to it. His slime body swelled, and from his center erupted a deafening roar, a sound that was not sound but pure force, a shockwave that shattered stalactites and sent ripples through the demigod's form. The serpentine figure flickered, its edges blurring. The pressure in the room lessened. The demigod's voice became distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Impressive. But futile. Lyra grabbed Kael, or rather, scooped him up, his slime body conforming to her arms. I can sense its weak point, she said urgently. Near the heart of the dungeon, where its physical form is anchored. If we destroy that anchor, it will be vulnerable. How do you know this? Kael asked, his voice weak from the sacrifice. I was its sacrifice for a month. It spoke to me, bragged about its immortality. It has a flaw, a single point where its divinity is tied to the mortal plane. A crystal, embedded in its lair. The demigod's laugh echoed, not from the fading vision, but from everywhere. The cavern walls rippled like water, and the floor split into a maze of mirrors, hundreds of them, reflecting their images back at them in infinite recursion. Each reflection showed a different version, Kael as a slime, as a goblin, as a dragon. Lyra as a corpse, as a queen, as a withered crone. You seek my weakness, the demigod's voice taunted. Then find it. But beware, every mirror shows a truth you are not ready to face. The mirrors shifted, rearranging themselves into a labyrinth. Lyra and Kael stood at the entrance, their reflections staring back at them from 1,000 angles. The path behind them had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of reflective glass. Lyra set Kael down, her breath misting in the cold. We stick together. Don't trust the mirrors. They'll show you what you fear most. Kael's core pulsed. He had no eyes, no ears, but he could feel the mirrors humming with latent magic. Each one was a trap, a lie, a promise. Some showed him escaping the dungeon, whole and human again. Others showed him consuming Lyra, evolving into a monstrosity without conscience. The images flickered, tempting, tormenting. Which way? He asked. Lyra pointed to a mirror that showed a path of black thorns. That one. It feels wrong. The demigod wouldn't want us to go there. As they stepped forward, the mirrors whispered in a language older than elves, older than men. Kael felt his core ache with the weight of sacrificed regret. But he pushed on, following Lyra into the labyrinth, knowing that every choice could be a dead end, and every dead end could be their grave. The labyrinth rose around Kael like a fever dream, each wall a sheet of polished obsidian that caught the dim phosphorescence of the dungeon ceiling and twisted it into mockeries of light. His slime body rippled as he pressed forward, the texture of the floor shifting beneath him, now slick as wet stone, now rough as pumice. The air smelled of copper and old dust, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped with a rhythm that matched no heartbeat he remembered. He stopped before the first mirror. It was tall, reaching from floor to ceiling, its surface so clear it might have been liquid silver frozen mid-pour. And in it, he saw a reflection that was not his own. A young man stood there, lean and broad-shouldered, with dirt-smudged cheeks and eyes that held a fire Kael recognized. The man wore leather armor, patched at the elbows, and carried a short sword that looked too heavy for his frame. He was laughing, a bright, unguarded sound, and beside him stood a girl with hair the color of autumn leaves, her face turned away, her hand reaching for something Kael couldn't see. Kael's core ached. He knew that face. He knew the curve of her jaw, the way her fingers curled as if she were about to pluck a flower from the air. But when he tried to summon her name, there was only static, a hollow where the words should have been. Who are you? He whispered, and the reflection did not answer. It simply faded, the girl dissolving into motes of light, the young man's laughter turning to echo. He pushed on. The labyrinth twisted and turned, each corridor lined with mirrors that showed him fragments of a life he could no longer claim. In one, he saw himself as a child, running through a field of wheat, the stalks brushing his knees. In another, he was older, sitting at a wooden table, a bowl of stew steaming before him, and across from him sat a man with kind eyes and a beard streaked with gray. Eat up, boy, the reflection said, though the voice came from nowhere. You'll need your strength for tomorrow. Kael tried to hold on to the image, but it slipped through his grasp like water. The man's name, was it Heston? Halden, evaporated before he could catch it. He moved faster, desperate to escape the gallery of ghosts. But the mirrors only multiplied, their surfaces rippling with each step he took. And then he saw it, a reflection that moved when he did not. The clone stepped out of the glass, its body a perfect copy of his own slime form, yet darker, its edges bleeding into shadow. It had no eyes, but he felt its gaze like a weight on his core. It spoke in a voice that was his own, but layered, as if many voices spoke at once. You can't run from what you've lost. Kael's instincts screamed. He had no weapon, no form but the slime, and the clone was already lunging, its pseudopod sharpening into a blade of obsidian. He rolled, or rather, he flattened and flowed sideways, the blade grazing his surface and sending a shock of cold through his being. Soul anchoring, he thought, reaching into the well of emotions he had learned to tap. He found the pain, the raw, searing memory of the rogue alchemist's needle, the betrayal that had burned through his veins as he transformed. It was still there, a hot coal buried in his core. He seized it, let it fuel the activation. Goblin's cunning. The ability surged through him, and the world sharpened. He saw the clone's movements not as a blur, but as a pattern, a slight hesitation before each strike, a tell in the way its mass shifted before it attacked. He flowed to the side, let the clone overextend, then wrapped himself around its base, squeezing with all the pressure he could muster. The clone thrashed, its form dissolving into shards of light that scattered across the floor. Kael released his grip, the pain he had sacrificed now a dull ache in the back of his mind, a scar that would not heal but would not spread. He looked down. Where the clone had shattered, something glinted on the stone floor. A locket, its silver chain snapped, its surface tarnished. He nudged it with a tendril, and it opened, revealing a lock of auburn hair and a tiny painting of a woman's face, the same face from the first mirror, the girl with autumn leaf hair. His sister. He knew it with a certainty that broke something inside him. But her name remained a phantom, dancing just beyond the reach of his thoughts. He closed the locket and tucked it into a fold of his slime body, holding it close to his core. It was a fragment, a clue, a promise that somewhere in this nightmare, there was a thread back to who he had been. The labyrinth groaned. The mirrors cracked, their surfaces spiderwebbing with fractures that spread like roots. Light poured through the breaks, harsh and white, and the walls began to collapse, not inward but outward, as if the entire structure was being peeled away. Kael braced himself, the ground shaking beneath him. He could see the ceiling now, high and vaulted, studded with crystals that pulsed with a sickly glow. And at the center of the chamber, where the labyrinth had hidden it, stood a throne of fused bone and metal. Above the throne, suspended in a cage of crystalline bars, was Lyra. Her dress was torn, her skin pale, her ears drooping with exhaustion. But her eyes were open, and when she saw him, they filled with a desperate hope that cut through the gloom. "Kael," she called, her voice hoarse. "The crystal anchor, it's in the throne's base. Destroy it." The demigod's laughter echoed, deep and mocking, as the throne began to turn, revealing a figure that was not yet fully formed, but growing, its limbs taking shape from the shadows. Kael looked at the locket in his core, then at Lyra's prison, and began to move. The demigod's voice rolled through the chamber like thunder, each syllable vibrating through Kael's gelatinous body. He lay at the base of the bone and metal throne, a puddle of translucent blue slime barely a foot wide, staring up at the crystal cage that held Lyra. The elf princess hung suspended, her silver hair matted with sweat, her emerald eyes fixed on him with a desperate hope that cut deeper than any blade. "Evolve," the demigod boomed, its form a shifting mass of shadow and molten gold, to warlock form. "The price is a memory, the face of your sister. Forget her, and the cage shatters. Refuse, and watch the elf starve." Kael's thoughts spiraled. Sister. The word echoed in the empty spaces where his name used to be. He had the locket, the lock of auburn hair, the miniature painting that showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. But her name was gone, erased by Goblin's cunning. Now the demigod demanded her face, the last tangible piece of her existence. He could feel the memory burning at the edges of his consciousness, a warm glow that he clutched like a dying ember in a blizzard. "No," he whispered, his voice a rasp that barely escaped his slime form. "There has to be another way." The demigod laughed, a sound like grinding bones. "There is no other way. You are a slime, a parasite of evolution. Each step forward costs a piece of what you were. That is the law of this dungeon, the law I enforce." It gestured with a clawed hand, and the crystal cage pulsed with a sickly light. Lyra moaned, her body trembling as the cage drained her life force. "She has days, perhaps hours. Choose, little worm." Lyra's voice cut through the despair, weak but clear. "Kael. I'll remember for you." He looked up, meeting her gaze. She smiled, a fragile thing that barely touched her lips. I'll carry her face in my heart. I'll tell you stories of her, of the way she laughed, the color of her hair. I'll be your memory until we find a way to bring it back. A surge of warmth spread through Kael's body, not from the memory but from her words. She was offering to bear the weight he couldn't carry alone. He thought of the rogue alchemist's betrayal, the pain he had sacrificed to gain Goblin's cunning. That pain had been a poison, but this was a gift. Lyra's promise was a lifeline, a thread of connection that could pull him through the darkness. He let out a shaky breath and focused on the system that hummed beneath his consciousness. Soul anchoring, he thought, sacrifice the memory of my sister's face. The system responded with a cold efficiency, presenting the cost like a merchant displaying wares. Warlock form would grant him Eldritch Blast and Arcane Sight, abilities that could shatter the cage and fight the demigod's minions. But the price was exact, the memory of his sister's face, the curve of her cheek, the light in her eyes, the way she smiled when she saw him. He closed his eyes, a habit from when he had them, and felt the memory rise like a bubble from the depths of his mind. It was warm, golden, filled with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of laughter. He saw her face, clear and perfect, and he memorized every detail, the freckles on her nose, the tiny scar above her eyebrow, the way her hair caught the sunlight. Then he let it go. The memory dissolved like mist in the morning sun, leaving a hollow ache where it had been. He gasped, his slime body convulsing as the evolution took hold. Dark energy coiled around him, black tendrils that wove into his core, reshaping his form. His body elongated, sprouting limbs of shadow and bone. A third eye opened on his forehead, glowing with violet light. His skin, if it could be called that, became a patchwork of obsidian scales and ethereal mist. He rose, towering over the demigod's throne, a creature of nightmare and power. Eldritch Blast, he thought, and a bolt of violet energy shot from his palm, striking the crystal cage. The cage shattered with a sound like 1,000 bells, shards of crystal raining down around Lyra. She fell, but Kael caught her with a tendril of shadow, lowering her gently to the ground. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with awe and gratitude. You did it, she whispered. But the demigod's roar shattered the moment. Fool! You've only delayed the inevitable. It raised its arms, and the shadows in the chamber came alive. From every corner, from beneath the throne, from the cracks in the walls, shadow creatures emerged, hounds with eyes of fire, serpents with fangs of ice, wraiths that whispered forgotten names. They formed a tide of darkness, surging toward Kael and Lyra. Kael stood in front of Lyra, his new form crackling with power. He raised his hand, and arcane sight revealed the creature's weaknesses. The hounds had cores of light in their chests, the serpents were vulnerable to fire, the wraiths feared the sound of a bell. He had no bell, but he had Eldritch Blast. He fired again, the violet bolt piercing a hound's core, causing it to dissolve into smoke. But more came, endless and hungry. Lyra pressed against his back, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. I can help. I know a spell, a ward against shadows. But I need time. Kael gritted his teeth, another phantom sensation from his human days. Then take it. I'll hold them back. He fired blast after blast, each one draining a piece of his energy. The creatures swarmed, clawing at his shadowy limbs, biting into his essence. He felt himself weakening, the evolution's power waning under the onslaught. But he couldn't stop. He had sacrificed his sister's face for this moment, for Lyra's life. He would not let that sacrifice be in vain. The last thing he saw before the darkness closed in was Lyra's hands glowing with silver light, her lips moving in an ancient incantation. Then the shadows consumed him, and he felt nothing but the cold embrace of oblivion. You shouldn't have done that, Kael said, his voice a guttural rasp from his dragonkin throat. You needed it, she whispered. I saw your lifespan, Kael. It's barely a flicker. This will buy us time. Kael felt a lump in his throat, or what passed for one. He remembered nothing of his sister's face now, but Lyra's words stirred something deep. He carried her toward the hidden exit, his body shifting to a more humanoid shape to support her weight. The pathway was narrow, lined with jagged rocks that scraped against his slime. At the end, a shimmering barrier blocked their way, a wall of purple energy, pulsing with malevolent light. Kael set Lyra down and pressed a tendril against it. The barrier burned, sending a jolt of pain through him. I can't break it, he said. I can, Lyra said, kneeling. She placed her hands on the barrier and began to chant again. Her voice was strained, her body trembling. Kael stood guard, his senses on high alert. The shadows had not followed them into the passage, but he could feel their presence just beyond the entrance, waiting. Minutes passed. The barrier began to crack, lines of light spreading like a spiderweb. Lyra gasped, her hands smoking. Almost, there. A sound echoed from the shadows behind them. Heavy footsteps. Clanking armor. Kael turned to see a figure emerge from the darkness, a knight clad in black plate armor, his sword glowing with purple fire. The shadows parted for him, bowing as he passed. His helm was featureless, save for 2 pinpricks of red light where eyes should be. The demigod's lieutenant, Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. The Shadow Knight. The knight drew his sword, the blade humming with power. You will not leave, he said, his voice a hollow echo. The demigod demands your souls. Kael stepped forward, his body shifting to a combat-ready form. He had no memory of his sister's face, but he remembered Lyra's promise. She would remember for him. He would not let her die here. Lyra, he said, his voice low. Keep working. I'll hold him. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Be careful. Kael faced the Shadow Knight, his core burning with determination. The knight raised his sword, and the shadows around him coalesced into a storm of darkness. Kael's arcane sight showed him the knight's weakness, a crack in his armor, where the light of his soul flickered. Come on, then, Kael growled, his voice a mix of dragon and slime. Let's see what you've got. The knight charged, his sword leaving a trail of shadow. Kael dodged, using his slime's fluidity to slide under the swing. He struck with Eldritch Blast, the energy hitting the knight's shield. The impact sent sparks flying, but the knight didn't flinch. He swung again, and Kael barely avoided the blade as it sliced through the air where his core had been. Lyra's chant grew louder. The barrier was cracking faster now, shards of purple light falling like rain. The knight noticed, and he turned toward her. Kael threw himself in the way, using hobgoblin strength to grapple the knight's sword arm. The knight's strength was immense, and Kael felt his slime tearing under the pressure. You're weak, the knight said. A slime pretending to be a warrior. Kael snarled. I'm a slime who survived this long. That's more than you can say. He released the knight and used his momentum to spin, landing a blow with his tail. The knight staggered, and Kael saw his chance. He focused all his energy into a single eldritch blast, aiming at the crack in the armor. The beam struck true, and the knight screamed as the light pierced his form. He dissolved into shadows, his sword clattering to the ground. But the victory was short-lived. The knight's form began to reform, the shadows coalescing again. You cannot kill me, he said, his voice echoing. I am bound to this dungeon. Lyra cried out. It's open. Kael turned. The barrier had shattered, revealing a narrow tunnel that led upward, toward a faint light. He grabbed Lyra and pulled her through, just as the knight's sword swung at the space where they had been. They ran, the tunnel winding upward. The light grew brighter, and Kael could feel fresh air, a breeze, carrying the scent of earth and grass. They burst out of the tunnel, stumbling into a forest clearing. The sky was gray, but it was the sky. They had escaped the dungeon. But as they caught their breath, a shadow fell over them. The Shadow Knight had followed, his form emerging from the tunnel's mouth. He stood between them and the forest, his sword gleaming. The demigod's domain extends beyond the dungeon, he said. There is no escape. Kael looked at Lyra. She was exhausted, barely standing. He was weakened, his core flickering. But he would not give up. Not now. Then we'll fight, Kael said. We'll fight until we can't, and then we'll fight some more. The knight laughed, a hollow sound. Brave words. But words cannot save you. He raised his sword, and the shadows around him swirled into a vortex. Kael braced himself, his body shifting to a defensive form. The knight charged, and Kael met him head-on. Their clash sent a shockwave through the clearing, trees bending, leaves scattering. Kael's slime tore, but he held on, using every ounce of strength to keep the knight at bay. Lyra began to chant again, her voice a whisper against the wind. Kael, she said, her voice breaking. I'm sorry. I can't. I don't have the strength. Kael's heart, or what served as one, sank. He was alone. He had sacrificed his sister's memory for this, and now it might not be enough. But then he felt something. A warmth in his core, a memory that wasn't his own. It was Lyra's voice, echoing in his mind, I'll remember for you. He held on to that. He held on to her promise. And he fought. The forest clearing was deathly silent, save for the ragged breaths of Kael and Lyra. The Shadow Knight stood before them, a dark silhouette against the dappled moonlight, its armor seeming to drink the light from the air. Kael's slime body quivered with exhaustion, his translucent form barely holding the shape of a humanoid. Beside him, Lyra leaned against a gnarled oak, her elven features pale and drawn, her green eyes dimmed with fatigue. The knight moved. There was no warning, no sound of footsteps, just a blur of darkness as it lunged, a shadowy blade aimed at Kael's core. Kael rolled, his slime body splashing against the forest floor, reforming just in time to avoid the strike. The blade cleaved through a tree behind him, splitting it in two with a sound like thunder. Sap and splinters sprayed across the clearing. Lyra, stay back. Kael shouted, his voice guttural and strained. He could feel the warlock form clawing at his mind, demanding to be unleashed. It was a dangerous form, one that fed on memories to fuel its power. But the Shadow Knight was relentless, its attacks coming faster and faster. Kael dodged, weaved, and absorbed a glancing blow that sent a shockwave through his body. Pain lanced through him, but worse was the hunger, the form's hunger for his past. I can't keep this up, he muttered, his thoughts racing. The warlock form was the only way to match the knight's speed and strength. But each second in that form would cost him a memory. He thought of his sister's face, the way she laughed, the way she called his name. He couldn't lose that. Not again. But the knight gave him no choice. It raised its blade, and shadows coiled around it, forming a spear of pure darkness. Kael's instinct screamed. He had to act. He reached deep inside himself, not for a memory, but for the anger, the boiling rage he felt toward the alchemist who had done this to him. The rage that had festered in the darkness of the abyss. He latched onto it, felt its heat, and let it flow into the warlock form. Soul anchoring, he whispered, and the anger dissolved like smoke, replaced by a cold, focused power. The warlock form surged around him, black tendrils of energy wrapping his slime body, hardening into a skeletal armor of shadow and bone. His eyes burned with violet light. He raised a hand, and dark energy crackled at his fingertips. Eldritch blast. A beam of violet energy erupted from his palm, slamming into the Shadow Knight's chest. The force of the blast sent the knight skidding backward, its feet carving furrows in the earth. The shadowy armor cracked, fissures spreading like spiderwebs. The knight let out a sound like grinding stones, its form flickering. But it didn't fall. It straightened, its hollow gaze fixed on Kael. Impressive, it said, its voice a whisper of wind. But you cannot defeat the demigod's will. It lunged again, faster this time. Kael tried to summon another blast, but the energy was slow to respond. The knight's blade came down, aimed at his core. He braced for impact. A spear of pure sunlight pierced the knight's back, emerging from its chest in a burst of golden light. The knight froze, its blade inches from Kael's face. It looked down at the light, then at Lyra, who stood with her hand outstretched, her eyes blazing with determination. The sunlight spear dissolved, and the Shadow Knight crumbled into ash, scattering on the wind. Lyra collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath. That was the last of my strength, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But it's done. Kael rushed to her side, the warlock form receding, leaving him weak and trembling. You saved me, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Thank you. Lyra managed a weak smile. We're partners now, remember? I don't let my partners die. As the ash settled, a glint caught Kael's eye. He moved toward where the knight had fallen and found a small, obsidian key, pulsing with a faint black light. He picked it up, and it hummed in his hand. This must be the key to the barrier, he said. We can use it to seal the dungeon behind us. Lyra nodded, struggling to her feet. Then let's go. I don't want to spend another minute near that place. They turned to leave, but a voice echoed through the clearing, deep and resonant, as if the very forest was speaking. You escape, but your sister's memory is gone forever. Was it worth it? Kael froze. The word struck him like a physical blow. He looked down at his hands, at the faint traces of shadow still clinging to them. The anger he had sacrificed, it had been the only thing keeping the memory of his sister alive. Now, he couldn't remember her face. He couldn't remember her name. The void in his heart ached. Lyra touched his arm. Kael. What's wrong? He didn't answer. He couldn't. The demigod's laughter echoed one last time, then faded into silence. Kael stared into the darkness of the forest, the key cold in his hand, and wondered if the price of freedom had been too high. The obsidian key pulsed in Kael's grip, its surface slick with residual heat from the Shadow Knight's defeat. He stood at the edge of the clearing, where the forest gave way to a massive stone archway carved into the cliffside. The barrier shimmered like a sheet of black water, rippling with faint silver runes that writhed like living serpents. Beyond it, the air smelled of dust and freedom, the surface world, just a step away. Lyra leaned against a moss-covered boulder, her breathing shallow. The sunlight spear had drained her more than she let on, her fingers trembled as she adjusted the torn fabric of her tunic. "Kael," she said softly, "we're almost there. Why are you stopping?" He couldn't answer. His hand hovered inches from the barrier, but his feet refused to move. The void inside him, the place where his sister's memory had once lived, pulsed with a dull ache. He could recall her voice, a lullaby hummed on quiet nights, but the face? Gone. Erased like chalk wiped from a slate. The only trace was a faint warmth in his chest, a ghost of emotion that refused to solidify into an image. I can't remember her smile," he whispered. The words tasted like ash. "I sacrificed it. I chose to forget her." Lyra pushed herself upright, her elven ears drooping. She limped to his side, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was cold, but grounding. "You did what you had to. We both did. But that doesn't mean the memory is gone forever." She reached into a pouch at her belt, pulling out a small, translucent stone that caught the dim light of the dungeon's phosphorescent moss. It was no bigger than her thumb, shaped like a teardrop, and inside it swirled a faint silver mist. "A memory stone," she explained. "Elven artisans craft them to preserve moments of joy before they fade. It can store one memory, a single, vivid recollection. But it cannot create what is lost. Only hold what remains." Kael stared at the stone. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat that matched the rhythm of his thoughts. What remained? He had sacrificed his sister's memory to gain the warlock form, to save Lyra. But the act of sacrifice had left a scar, a faint impression, like a footprint in drying mud. Could he salvage anything from that? "Close your eyes," Lyra instructed. "Focus on the emptiness. Let it speak to you." He obeyed. The darkness behind his eyelids was absolute. He searched for the void where his sister had been, probing it with the tendrils of his consciousness. At first, there was nothing, just a cold, hollow silence. But then, like a candle flickering in a distant window, he felt it, a warmth, a whisper of affection, a sense of belonging that had no name or face. It was the faintest trace of her smile, not as an image, but as an emotion. A feeling of being loved unconditionally. "I feel something," he breathed. "But it's not a memory. It's just, a feeling." "That's enough," Lyra said. "Press it into the stone." Kael opened his eyes and placed his palm over the memory stone. He summoned the soul anchoring technique, the same method he had used to sacrifice his anger. But this time, he channeled not a negative emotion, but a positive one, the fear of loneliness that had gnawed at him since his transformation. He let that fear flow into the stone, wrapping it around the fragile wisp of his sister's smile. The stone grew warm, then hot, then cool again. The silver mist coalesced into a single, shimmering image, a young woman with auburn hair and kind eyes, her lips curved in a gentle smile. It was incomplete, like a sketch missing details, but it was enough. "Hold on to that," Lyra said softly. "It's not the whole memory, but it's a piece. A fragment of who she was." Kael clutched the stone to his chest. The void inside him felt less vast now, filled with the warmth of that preserved smile. He looked at the barrier, his resolve hardening. "Let's finish this." He inserted the obsidian key into a slot in the center of the archway. The stone groaned, and the barrier rippled violently before parting like a curtain. Beyond it, a stone staircase spiraled upward, leading to a patch of pale blue sky. Freedom. But as Kael took his first step, the ground trembled, and a voice like grinding mountains echoed from the depths of the dungeon. "Did you think you could leave so easily?" The air grew heavy. Shadows pooled at the base of the staircase, coalescing into a massive form. The demigod emerged, its body a fusion of obsidian and bone, with eyes that burned like twin suns. It stood 12 feet tall, its arms ending in claws that could rend steel. Its voice was a symphony of malice. "You stole my sacrifice. You killed my knight. And now you dare to take my key. Kael stepped in front of Lyra, his slime body shifting into a defensive stance. The warlock form's power still hummed in his veins, but he knew it was not enough. Not against this. The demigod's gaze locked onto him, and the weight of its attention made his bones ache. You have no idea what you've unleashed, the demigod snarled. But I will teach you. Slowly. Kael's hand tightened around the memory stone. He could feel his sister's smile pressing against his palm, a reminder of what he had already lost and what he still had to protect. He looked at Lyra, who had drawn a dagger with trembling hands. They were cornered, exhausted, and facing a god. But he would not back down. Not now. Not ever. Lyra, he said, his voice steady despite the terror coiling in his gut. When I give the signal, run. She shook her head. I won't leave you. You will, he said, turning to face the demigod. Because I'm not done fighting yet. The staircase to the surface loomed behind the demigod, its stone steps slick with moisture that glistened like tears in the dim light. Kael's gelatinous body quivered as he pressed against Lyra, who leaned heavily on her staff, her breathing ragged. The demigod stood before them, a towering figure of obsidian and malice, its form shifting like smoke solidified into flesh. Its eyes burned with a crimson fire that seemed to pierce through Kael's very core, and when it spoke, the words resonated in his mind like 1,000 shattering crystals. You dare to defy me, the demigod thundered, its voice a cascade of thunder that shook the cavern walls. Dust rained from the ceiling, and Kael felt the vibrations through his amorphous body. He had no mouth to scream, no lungs to gasp, but the fear that coiled in his gut was a familiar ache. He had sacrificed his fear of loneliness, but this was different, this was the primal terror of annihilation. Without warning, the demigod raised a hand, and the air around them twisted. A sphere of violet energy coalesced in its palm, crackling with arcs of black lightning. Kael's instincts screamed, and he lunged forward, his body stretching into a thin sheet that wrapped around Lyra. He dragged her to the side just as the sphere exploded, sending a shockwave that shattered the ground where they had stood. Stone fragments flew like shrapnel, and Kael felt a sharp sting as a piece embedded itself in his core. Pain flared, but he had no blood to spill. Kael! Lyra shouted, her voice muffled by his translucent form. She struggled against his grip, but he held her tight, his body undulating to absorb the impact of more debris. The demigod laughed, a sound like grinding bones, and advanced toward them, each step shaking the earth. We need to move. Kael projected his thoughts into Lyra's mind, a skill he had developed through their bond. He released her and reformed into a more solid shape, a humanoid silhouette with tendrils for arms. He focused his energy, and a dark aura enveloped him. The warlock form surged through him, a torrent of forbidden power that twisted his perception. His vision sharpened, and he saw the world in layers of magical energy. The demigod's aura was a maelstrom of crimson and black, pulsing with a rhythm like a heartbeat. But with the form came a cost. A memory surfaced, a warm kitchen, the smell of bread baking, his mother's voice humming a lullaby. The image faded like smoke, and Kael felt a void open in his chest. He had sacrificed his childhood home, a place of safety and love. Now it was gone, replaced by the cold knowledge of arcane patterns and eldritch sigils. Arcane sight, he whispered, and his vision shifted. He saw the threads of magic that wove through the cavern, the ley lines that pulsed beneath the stone. The demigod's next attack was a bolt of pure force, and Kael saw its trajectory before it was launched. He twisted, his body flowing like water, and the bolt passed through the space where he had been, striking a stalactite that crashed down behind him. Lyra raised her staff, and a green light emanated from her. Nature's wrath, she cried, and vines erupted from the ground, twisting around the demigod's legs. The creature roared, its form flickering as it struggled against the bindings. But the vines withered under its dark aura, turning to ash within seconds. Buy me time. Kael projected, his mind racing. He studied the demigod's form, searching for a weakness. His arcane sight revealed a faint crack in the creature's chest, a hairline fracture where its obsidian scales didn't quite align. It was a flaw, a remnant of some ancient wound or imperfection in its creation. If he could strike there, he might cripple it. But to do so, he needed power. He began to channel energy into his core, drawing on the warlock form's deepest reserves. Dark flames licked at his body, and the air around him grew cold. He formed a sphere of eldritch energy in his hands, its surface swirling with galaxies of violet and black. The eldritch blast was a weapon of pure destruction, a spell that could shatter stone and rend flesh. But it demanded a sacrifice. As the energy built, Kael felt a tug at the edges of his mind. A memory surfaced, a small locket, silver and tarnished, with a lock of hair inside. His sister's locket. She had worn it every day, a gift from their mother before she died. The image was vivid, the way the light caught the metal, the faint scent of lavender that clung to it, the warmth of her hand as she placed it in his palm, saying, "Keep this safe for me, Kael. It's all I have left of her." He had kept it safe, even after the transformation. It was the last physical connection to his sister, the only proof that she had existed. But now, the eldritch blast demanded a price. He could feel the spell hungering, reaching for that memory, ready to consume it for fuel. Lyra stumbled back, her face pale. "Kael, I can't hold her much longer," she shouted, pointing at the demigod, who was breaking free of another wave of vines. Kael's tendrils tightened around the sphere of energy. He had a choice: release the blast and lose the locket's memory, or hold back and risk everything. The demigod's eyes locked onto him, and it smiled, a terrible, knowing smile, as if it sensed his hesitation. "You cannot escape," the demigod hissed. "Every memory you sacrifice brings you closer to oblivion. You will become nothing, a hollow shell, and I will feast on your despair." Kael's core pulsed with rage. He thought of Lyra, of her kindness, of the hope she had given him. He thought of his sister, of her laughter, her courage, her love. He couldn't lose that. He couldn't. But as the demigod raised its hand for a killing blow, Kael made his decision. He poured every ounce of his will into the eldritch blast, and the memory of the locket began to fade, its edges blurring like a painting washed away by rain. The sphere grew brighter, hotter, until it was a miniature sun in his grasp. For her, he roared, and he released the blast. The world narrowed to a single point of light, the crack in the demigod's scale, glowing like a malevolent star. Kael's amorphous body thrummed with power he didn't fully understand, a dark energy coiling in his core like a serpent ready to strike. The memory of his sister's locket surfaced unbidden, the cool silver against his fingers, the engraved initials EK for Elara Kael, the tiny dent from when she dropped it on the cobblestones outside their home. He could almost hear her laugh, a sound that had anchored him through the darkest moments of his transformation. Then the memory began to dissolve. It started at the edges, like paper catching flame. The feel of the locket's chain slipped away first, then the weight of it in his palm. The initials blurred, the dent smoothed into nothing. Elara's laugh faded to a whisper, then silence. Kael tried to hold on, to grasp at the fragments, but they crumbled like ash in a mental wind. A hollow ache spread through his chest, not physical, but deeper, a scar on his soul where something precious had been torn away. But the powers surged in response. The eldritch blast erupted from him, a lance of violet-black energy that screamed through the cavern. It struck the crack with surgical precision, and the demigod roared, a sound that shook the very foundations of the dungeon. Stone cracked overhead, and dust rained down like grey snow. The demigod staggered, one hand clutching its chest where the blast had penetrated, ichor spilling between its fingers. Its eyes, burning with ancient fury, locked onto Kael. "You insect," it hissed, voice like grinding boulders. "You dare wound me? I will unmake you, piece by piece. Your memories will feed my hatred for eternity." But it didn't attack. Instead, it took a step back, then another. The wound was deep, and even a demigod could not ignore such a strike. Dark smoke curled from the crack, and the creature's form flickered, unstable. It snarled, spitting a glob of black blood onto the floor, then turned and vanished into the shadows of a side passage, its parting curse hanging in the air. "This is not over. I will find you, slime. And when I do, I will devour your soul." Lyra was already at Kael's side, her face pale, her breaths ragged. She grabbed him, her hands passing through his slime body before she adjusted, scooping him up like a child carrying a strange pet. "We have to go. Now." She ran. Kael's vision blurred as she sprinted through the exit tunnel. The light at the end grew, a pinprick of gold that expanded into a blaze. Fresh air hit him, real air, not the stale, death-tinged atmosphere of the dungeon. The scent of pine and earth flooded his senses, so overwhelming that he felt his slime body quiver in response. Then they collapsed. Lyra fell to her knees, gasping, her hands releasing Kael as she slumped against a tree trunk. The forest around them was alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves, a stark contrast to the nightmare they had escaped. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the mossy ground with patches of warmth. Kael lay still, his body slowly solidifying. The slime that had been his form for what felt like an eternity began to shift, to take on a familiar shape. Arms. Legs. A torso. He watched, detached, as his hands formed, pale, slender, with dirt under the nails. Human hands. He pushed himself up, staring at them. They were his hands. They were real. He was human again. But something was wrong. He looked around the forest, at the trees, the sky, the elf princess panting beside him. A name came to his lips, Lyra. He knew her. She had helped him escape. But why? Why had he been in a dungeon? Why had he wanted to escape? He tried to remember. A face flickered in his mind, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, but it dissolved before he could grasp it. A locket. There was a locket, but he couldn't remember whose it was or why it mattered. He felt a pang of loss, a hole in his chest where something vital used to be, but the memory itself was gone. Why did I want to escape? He whispered, his voice hoarse, unfamiliar. Lyra looked up, her eyes wide with concern. Kael. He turned to her, his expression blank. Who is Kael? The forest held its breath. A bird called out, then fell silent. The sunlight seemed to dim, as if the world itself was waiting for an answer that would never come. The village of Thornwell was a cluster of thatched roofs and mud walls, nestled in a valley where the forest gave way to terraced fields. Kael sat on a wooden bench outside the healer's hut, staring at his hands. They were human hands, pale, calloused, with dirt under the nails. He flexed his fingers, watching the tendons move beneath the skin. It felt wrong. Not the hands themselves, but the act of having hands. He remembered being something else. A slime. A goblin. A dragonkin. But those memories were like echoes in a cavern, bouncing off walls he couldn't see. Lyra emerged from the hut, her steps unsteady. She had washed the dungeon grime from her face, and her silver hair hung in damp strands over her pointed ears. She wore a simple linen dress borrowed from the village elder, and a woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She sat beside him on the bench, close enough that he could smell the herbs she'd used to treat her wounds, rosemary and thyme, mixed with something bitter. How do you feel? She asked, her voice soft. Kael didn't answer immediately. He felt hollow. Like a gourd that had been scraped clean of its seeds. I don't know why I'm here, he said finally. I mean, I know we escaped. I know you're an elf princess. But I don't know why I wanted to leave the dungeon. Lyra's hands trembled as she reached into her pouch. She pulled out a small, smooth stone, no larger than her thumb. It was milky white, with veins of blue that pulsed faintly like a heartbeat. This is a memory stone, she said. The elves use them to store important recollections. When I was chained in that chamber, I used the last of my magic to record a fragment of your memory. The one you sacrificed to save me. Kael stared at the stone. Something stirred in his chest, a pang of recognition, or longing. What will it do? It will show you what you lost. But only that one memory. Nothing else. Lyra's eyes glistened. I'm sorry. I couldn't save the rest. He took the stone. It was warm in his palm, and the blue veins began to glow brighter. He held it up to his face, and the world dissolved. He was in a garden. Sunlight filtered through the leaves of an old oak tree, dappling the grass. A girl sat on a swing made of rope and wood, her laughter ringing like bells. She had brown hair tied in 2 braids, and a gap between her front teeth. She was maybe 12 years old. She looked at him, looked at the person whose eyes he was seeing through, and smiled. Kael. Push me higher. He felt his own lips move, felt the joy that swelled in his chest. He knew this girl. He knew her name. It was on the tip of his tongue, a word he could almost taste. But when he tried to speak it, the garden flickered, and the girl's face began to blur. No, he whispered. Please, no. The memory crumbled like ash. He was back on the bench, the stone cold in his hand. Tears streamed down his cheeks, though he didn't remember starting to cry. One tear fell onto the stone, and the blue veins went dark. Did you see her? Lyra asked, her voice breaking. Yes, Kael said. She was my sister. I know that much. But I can't remember her name. I can't remember anything else. Lyra took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. It's a start, she said. We'll find the rest. I promise. He wanted to believe her. But the hollow feeling in his chest only grew deeper. He had traded his sister's memory for Lyra's life. He knew it was the right choice, he would make it again, but the cost was a wound that wouldn't heal. A commotion at the village gate drew their attention. A rider on a lathered horse galloped into the square, scattering chickens and children. The rider wore the livery of a noble house, a silver falcon on a blue field, and his face was pale with urgency. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped and ran toward the elder's hut. "Lyra, wait here," Kael said, standing. His legs felt weak, but he forced them to move. The rider was speaking to the village elder, a gray-haired woman with a walking stick. When Kael approached, the rider's eyes widened. "You're the one," he said. "The slime that escaped the abyss." "I'm not a slime anymore," Kael said. "It doesn't matter. The demigod has sent word to every lord in the region. There's a bounty on your head, 5,000 gold pieces, alive or dead. And it's not just the demigod's forces. Mercenaries, adventurers, even some of the lesser nobles are hunting you. They think you carry some treasure from the dungeon." Lyra stepped up beside Kael, her hand on his arm. "We need to leave," she said. "Now." The elder nodded. "There's a path through the whispering woods that leads to the elven border. It's dangerous, but it's the only way that won't be watched." Kael looked at the memory stone in his palm, then at Lyra. The sister's smile was already fading from his mind's eye, replaced by the cold reality of the present. He had lost so much. But he was still here. He could still fight. "Show us the path," he said. As they gathered supplies, Kael caught a glimpse of his reflection in a rain barrel. A stranger stared back at him, a man with haunted eyes and a face he didn't recognize. He wondered how many more pieces of himself he would have to lose before this was over. And whether, in the end, there would be anything left worth saving. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Thornwell as Kael stood at the village's eastern gate, his translucent body shimmering with an unnatural light. The bounty notice from the demigod had changed everything. He could no longer hide, no longer pretend that the fragments of his past were merely lost in the chaos of transformation. They were stolen, and the demigod held the key. Lyra approached, her elven cloak billowing in the crisp breeze. Her face was pale but determined, the hollows of her cheeks still bearing the marks of her recent starvation. She carried a satchel filled with dried herbs and a water skin, her only possessions in this world. "You're really going through with this," she said, her voice soft but steady. Kael turned to face her, his form rippling like liquid silver. "I have to. Every time I close my eyes, I see her smile. But I can't remember her name. I can't remember why she mattered. That void is worse than any pain the demigod can inflict." Lyra nodded, her hand brushing against the inert memory stone at her belt. "Then I'm coming with you. You saved my life, Kael. I owe you a debt I can never repay. But I can help you navigate the whispering woods, and I know the paths to the demigod's fortress." "You don't owe me anything," Kael replied, but he felt a warmth in his core, a flicker of gratitude that hadn't been erased. "The village elder said the woods are treacherous." "Are you sure?" "I've survived the abyss dungeon, Kael. A few enchanted trees won't stop me." She smiled, and for a moment, the weight of their mission seemed lighter. They spent the morning gathering supplies. The village elder, a weathered man named Oren, provided them with rations and a map marked with safe passages. "The demigod's fortress lies beyond the whispering woods, at the edge of the cinder wastes," he explained, his finger tracing a path through the dense forest. "But beware, the woods are alive with illusions. Trust your instincts, not your eyes." Kael absorbed the information, his slime body quivering with anticipation. He had evolved many times, but each evolution had cost him a piece of himself. Now, he needed to master his warlock form without sacrificing another memory. The form granted him devastating power, shadow tendrils and soul-rending curses, but it demanded a toll he could no longer afford to pay. As they prepared to leave, Kael retreated to a quiet corner of the village, focusing on his internal energy. He felt the weight of his guilt, the lingering shame of forgetting his sister, the regret of every life he had consumed to survive. He channeled those emotions into his core, letting them burn like fuel. "Soul anchoring," he whispered, and the guilt dissolved, replaced by a surge of power that coursed through his being. The warlock form settled over him like a second skin, its dark energy pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. He had done it, he had unlocked the form without losing a single memory. Lyra watched from a distance, her eyes wide with awe. "You did it," she said as he rejoined her. "I felt the shift in the air. It was like the forest itself held its breath. It worked, Kael confirmed, his voice deeper, tinged with an otherworldly resonance. But I can't rely on it too much. The guilt I sacrificed was strong, but it's gone now. I'll need to find other emotions to fuel future evolutions. Then let's find the demigod and take back what's yours, Lyra said, her hand resting on the hilt of her dagger. They set out at noon, the sun high overhead as they entered the whispering woods. The trees were ancient, their bark covered in glowing runes that hummed with latent magic. The path was narrow, winding between trunks so thick that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. Strange whispers filled the air, voices that seemed to come from the leaves themselves. Lost, lost. Find your way. They murmured, but Kael pressed on, ignoring the temptation to follow the sounds. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker. The canopy blocked out the sun, casting them into a twilight world of shadows and flickering lights. Lyra led the way, her elven senses piercing the gloom. There's a clearing ahead, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But I sense something wrong. The magic here is thick, like a trap. They emerged into a circular clearing where the ground was covered in silver moss. In the center stood a stone pedestal, and on it lay a single object, a locket, identical to the one from Kael's memory. His core lurched. That's hers, he breathed, moving toward it. Wait. Lyra grabbed his arm. It's an illusion. The forest is testing you. But Kael couldn't stop. The locket called to him, promising answers, promising his sister's face. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the cold metal. The world shattered. He was standing in a village, surrounded by familiar faces he couldn't name. A young woman with chestnut hair and kind eyes smiled at him. Kael, you're back early, she said. Did you find the herbs? He opened his mouth to respond, but the scene dissolved into mist. He was back in the clearing, his hand still on the locket. The silver moss had turned black, and the trees around them were closing in, their branches sharpening into spears. It's a trap. Lyra shouted, drawing her dagger. The demigod knows we're coming. The branches lunged, and Kael unleashed the warlock form. Shadow tendrils erupted from his body, slicing through the wood with ease. He fought with a ferocity he hadn't known he possessed, each strike fueled by the anger of his stolen memories. Lyra moved beside him, her blade flashing as she deflected attacks. When the last branch fell, the clearing was silent. The locket crumbled to dust, and Kael felt a pang of loss. It was never real, he said, his voice hollow. No, but it showed us something, Lyra replied, kneeling beside him. The demigod is afraid. He's setting traps because he knows you're coming. That means you have a chance. They continued through the woods, emerging at dusk onto a ridge overlooking the cinder wastes. In the distance, a fortress of black stone rose against the crimson sky, its spires piercing the clouds like claws. The demigod's lair. As they descended into the wastes, the ground cracked beneath their feet, heat radiating from the volcanic soil. Kael's slime body absorbed the warmth, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking of the locket, of the face in his memory, of the sister he couldn't remember. They stopped at a small outpost on the edge of the wastes, a ramshackle inn that catered to travelers and mercenaries. Lyra negotiated for a room while Kael scanned the notice board. Among the bounties and job postings, one caught his eye. A wanted poster. The face was unmistakable, the same chestnut hair, the same kind eyes from his vision. His sister. But the text beneath read, wanted, alive. Reward, 10,000 gold. Information leading to capture, 2,000 gold. Contact, the Silver Dawn Company. His core froze. She was alive. And she was looking for him. Lyra, he called, his voice trembling. Look at this. She read the poster, her eyes widening. Kael, that's your sister, isn't it? I don't know her name, he whispered. But I know her face. She's alive, and she's searching for me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The demigod had stolen his memories, but his sister was out there, somewhere, trying to find him. The quest had just become personal. He tore the poster from the board and folded it carefully, tucking it into his core. We find the demigod, he said, his voice hard as steel. And we make him pay for every memory he's taken. The night air was cold, but the fire in Kael's heart burned hotter than the wastes themselves.